Welcome to Counters. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the suspense account and correction of errors. We're going to go into these topics in great detail in explaining what the relationship is between the suspense account and the correction of errors, and also look at the different types of errors and how they apply to the suspense account and how we deal with them. We're also going to explain in what situations is a suspense account created and what is the purpose for the suspense account. And we're also going to look at an example in application to what we will have learned with regard to the suspense account and correction of errors. We're also going to look at the different types of errors and how to deal with them. So, what is the suspense account? Well, a suspense account is an account used to temporarily keep transactions for which we are unsure about where they should be recorded. So if a transaction takes place and we're not sure where this should be allocated, then we open a suspense account. Remember, this is a temporary account because at some point we have to know where those transactions should be allocated or where those transactions should be recorded and remove them from the suspense account. That is the basic idea of what the suspense account is all about. So let's say that you are a bookkeeper or an accountant for a specific company and you've just received an amount of 10,000 Rand and you're not sure who sent this money and what it is for. Then you will allocate it to the suspense account until you can confirm where this amount should be allocated. That is why it's a temporary account. Once you confirm that this was paid by a supplier, but they didn't use their correct reference number, that's why you did not know where it should be allocated. But now the supplier is called or someone has informed you that this is from this specific supplier, then obviously you will allocate it as such. You will remove it from the suspense account and correctly allocate it. So that's the primary purpose of a suspense account, to keep temporary transactions until you know where they should be recorded if we did not know at first where they should have been recorded. Now, that's not the only situation that results in the suspense account being opened. So let's look at them here. A suspense account is opened under 3 specific situations, and you need to remember this. In what situations do I open a suspense account? Well, when we are unsure about which account a specific transaction relates to or where to post a specific item. That is what I've just mentioned from the definition of a suspense account. When we're not sure where the transaction should go or where we should post a specific item, and as I used that example, or you've received money and you're not sure where to allocate it, or you've seen that the money has left the company's bank account and it's been paid by the financial manager, for instance, but you do not know what it was paid for. Well, if you do not know at that moment, let's say the financial manager has gone on holiday and will be back next week, well, you will allocate to the suspense account temporarily, and when the financial manager is back, then you will ask him what the amount was for and you will allocate the amount accordingly, and therefore the suspense account is no longer there because you now know where the amount should be allocated. That is why you must remember that this is a temporary account. So that is the first situation in which you will use the suspense account. The second one is when the debit and the credit of the trial balance are not in agreement. So when they do not balance, that is when you have a suspense account being introduced. And you will see that when we look at an example and you'll get a better understanding of what you're dealing with. The third situation that results in the suspense account being created is related to the second one here. But how does it? Well, the correction of errors results in the suspense account being opened. But you must note that not all errors result in a suspense account being opened. And that is why we'll explain the different kinds of errors, and you will get a sense of which errors result in the suspense account being open and which one do not. And we'll go through the example as well, and looking at different errors, you will see which one would result in a suspense account being opened. So when you're correcting errors, you will also use a suspense account. So there are specific errors which necessitates the opening of a suspense account. So you have to understand them, and that is where students usually battle which kind of errors result in the suspense account being opened and which one do not result in the suspense account being opened. Well, we're going to look at that shortly, but just remember the specific situation that results in the suspense account being opened. As I've just mentioned, reason number 2 and reason number 3 are related because when we have errors, that means that our debit and our credit may not balance. It's not always the case, as we'll see shortly. Some errors may not affect the balancing of the trial balance, but some errors do. All right, so when it doesn't balance, then we create a suspense account. Now, Where students usually battle is with the types of errors that we will be dealing with here. So let's go into that. What you must remember is that there are errors that do not affect the balancing of the trial balance. All right, that means that my debit in my trial balance and my credit will still be the same, even though there may be some errors. All right, my trial balance might still balance, but there are errors which will be revealed by the trial balance, meaning that my trial balance will not balance, and therefore I will know that there is an error that was made somewhere. So let's firstly look at the different types of errors that are not disclosed by the trial balance. So when you look at the trial balance, the debit equals the credit, so you won't know that there is an error. So which types of errors are those? Very important that you remember this and you take note of this, because the suspense account depends on you understanding the different types of errors. All right, so these types of errors are not disclosed by the trial balance, and usually when they do not affect the trial balance, we do not open the suspense account, but that is not always the case. So let's look at the different types of errors. Well, the first one we're going to look at here is the omission error, or the error of omission. This occurs when a transaction is not recorded at all. All right, so this is the omission error, or we have omitted completely recording this transaction. That's why this type of error would sometimes be called complete omission error, meaning you have not recorded the transaction at all. So let's say you've just paid 20,000 Rand to your supplier, which you owed him because he took some goods on credit, and you forget to record the transaction altogether. Well, that would be an omission error. All right, and what does that mean for the suspense account? Well, the suspense account is not opened in this regard. So even you have an omission error or a complete omission error where you did not record the transaction at all, remember that you do not open a suspense account. And here is why. I'll show you with an example. Interest received 200 Rand was not recorded in the books. Well, if you received interest income of 200 Rand and you did not record it in your books, well, you will not open a suspense account. Why is that? Well, that's because you did not record the transaction at all. So now that you know that you made the mistake of not recording the transaction, what you'll do is just record the transaction as you would have recorded it initially. All right, so you'll have your debit and your credit. One thing I must mention here is if you're battling with your debit and your credit, or understanding what should be debited and what should be credited, you will struggle with the suspense account. So what I would encourage you to do is to look at the lessons in the links below that explains what the debit is, what the credit is, what you debit and what you credit, and in what situation, and we go through so many examples. So you'll find the links in the description below, and I would encourage you to do so before looking at these examples that we'll be going through, because when you're dealing with the correction of errors, we will be recording the transaction. Some will go on the debit, some will go on the credit, and some will be reversed. All right, we will reverse it because we are correcting an error. So for you to understand this one thoroughly, you must understand your debits and your credits. But if you do, we can go ahead here. So if we received interest of 200 Rand and did not record it in our books, what should we have recorded? What would have been our debit and what would have been our credit? Well, our debit would have been bank, because money is coming into the bank account and bank is an asset. We debit it. If you looked at the lessons in the links below, you should understand this. And we credit interest income. All right. Why? Because interest income is an income and income is recorded on the credit side. So that's what we do. Debit bank 200 Rand and credit interest income 200 Rand. Now, if this was easy enough for you, that means you understand your debits and your credits. But if you're confused as to why we debited and why we credited this, then chances are you've not looked at the lessons in the links in the description below. All right, so do check them out. So that is the first error that would be made. All right, the first type of error, omission error or complete omission error. All right, this is when you have not recorded the transaction at all. You can see here we did not open the suspense account. All right, if we did open it, you'd either see it on the debit side or on the credit side, but we don't have the suspense account as one of the accounts. We have bank and interest income. All right, that is why you need to remember omission errors, or when you have complete omission, when you do not record the transaction at all, you don't open the suspense account. I hope that was clear enough. Let's look at the second type of error. Remember, these errors are in no specific order. The second one we have here is the commission error, or the error of commission. This occurs when an amount is entered on the correct side of the wrong account, but to a correct category. In this case, if you have an error of commission, you do not open a suspense account. You just have to deal with the specific error. Now, The sentence here might not make sense, but we'll unpack it just now. And for us to do that, we also need to explain the third type of error, and you'll see why just now. The third one is the principal error, or the error of principle. Not to be confused with the error of commission, as it commonly is. The error of commission and the error of principle are usually confused. So you have to pay careful attention to the description of the two types of errors here. The error of principle occurs when an entry is posted to the correct side of a wrong category. And in this case, the suspense account is also not opened. So what's the difference between the error of commission and the error of principle? Well, as you can see here with the error of commission, you have posted to the correct side. What do you mean by the correct side? We mean if the account is supposed to be posted on the debit side, you have posted on the debit side, but you have put it to the wrong account. So instead of debiting one account, you've debited another account. Even though it's on the debit side, which is the correct side, it's to a wrong account, but it's to a correct category. I will explain what the correct category is just now. But with the principal error, you have posted to the correct side of a wrong category. So the difference between the two here is the categories. The commission error is posted to a correct category, and the principal error is posted to a wrong category. So what are the categories that we usually have? Well, here they are. We have assets, liabilities, income, and expenses. These are categories, or sometimes known as the class of accounts. So if you post it to a wrong class, let's say, for example, you are recording an asset that is come into the business. You're supposed to debit the specific asset, but instead of debiting an asset, you have debited an expense. Can you see here that you have debited the wrong category? Now, let's use a practical example. Let's say you've just bought a vehicle for cash. You've just bought a vehicle for cash. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to debit vehicles and credit bank, because money is leaving your account, so you credit bank and you debit vehicles. Bear in mind that both vehicle and bank are assets. All right, so you've got a vehicle which is an asset, and you've got bank which is an asset. Vehicle is increasing because it's coming in, you debit it, and bank you credit it because money is going out, even though they're both assets. But now let's say when you're doing the recording, you debit vehicles, which is correct, and instead of crediting bank, you credit creditors control or trade payables, meaning you bought this vehicle on credit. What have you just done? Well, you have recorded to the correct side. You have credited the amount, which is correct, but you have posted the wrong account, which is creditors control instead of bank. But notice here that bank is an asset, and what is creditors control? Well, if you looked at the lessons in the links in the description below, you would know that creditors control is a liability. So instead of crediting an asset, which is bank, you've credited creditors control, which is a liability. So wrong category. What does that mean? Commission error or principal error? Well, if it's a wrong category, you have a principal error. Let's use the same example again. You bought vehicle on cash, but this time, instead of debiting vehicle and crediting bank, you debited equipment instead, and you credited bank. So the credit side is correct. You credited bank and you put the amount there, but the debit, there's something wrong here. You've debited equipment instead of vehicle. Even though you recorded the amount on the correct side, meaning an asset is coming in, instead of debiting the correct account, you debited an incorrect account. So what is happening here? Well, you debited equipment and you credited bank. We've just mentioned that bank is correct because you bought a vehicle on cash. Bank, money is leaving our account, so we credit bank. But the debit side, instead of debiting vehicle, you've debited equipment. So what is vehicle here? Well, vehicle we know is an asset. And what is equipment? Equipment is also an asset. So what has happened here? Well, we are still within the correct category because equipment and vehicle are both assets. So you just switched one for the other. So you recorded to the correct side, meaning you debited the asset, but the wrong account. But it's also to a correct category because both equipment and vehicles are assets. What does that mean? Commission error or principal error? Well, if it's a correct category, you have a commission error or the error of commission. Very important for you to understand this and to know what account falls where. All right, and that is the difference between the error of commission and the error of principal. Sometimes if you're mistaken, you're not sure which one you're dealing with, you can use tips to try and remember this. For instance, here you've got the commission error. Remember, correct category. They both start with C, commission, correct. So you know the account would have been recorded to a correct category, but it's to a wrong account. But the principal error is to a wrong category. So you find a way of remembering that, but it's very important that you remember that when you're dealing with the correction of errors. All right, but remember, for these two errors, you do not open a suspense account. So let's use a practical example where you can see equipment bought for cash 2,000 Rand had been debited to the telephone account. What I'd encourage you to do here is to pause the video, attempt it on your own, or try and figure it out in your head what is happening here and which error you're dealing with, and then you can continue with the video. Well, I hope you've thought it through. Here, equipment was bought for cash 2,000 Rand. So what was supposed to be my debit and what was supposed to be my credit? Well, if I bought equipment for cash, I needed to have debited equipment because equipment is an asset coming in, and credit bank because bank is money leaving my account. That was supposed to be the correct account. But what have you done here? Well, instead of debiting equipment, you've debited telephone account. What is telephone? Well, if you look at the lessons I've been alluding to, telephone is an expense. Okay, so instead of debiting an asset, you've debited an expense. What does that mean? You've posted to the correct side but to a wrong category, because remember, expenses are debited when you incur them and assets are debited when you bring them in. So it's to a correct side but the wrong category, because instead of debiting an asset, you've debited an expense, and that makes it an error of principle. All right, I hope that has made sense, and I hope you are getting a sense of what's going on here. So here's what we did. The incorrect one is the debit. All right, instead of debiting equipment, we debited telephone and we credited bank. Remember, the credit side is correct, but the problem is the debit side. So how do we correct this error? Well, all we need to do is to clear out this 2,000 Rand for telephone. How do we do that? We put it onto the opposite side, the credit side. And that is why I said, for you to understand this, you need to thoroughly understand your debits and your credits. Okay, so we're going to put it on the credit side. So what are we going to debit instead? We're going to debit the correct account, which is equipment. So we debit equipment, which you should have done initially. And what do we credit? We credit telephone. Okay, why do we credit telephone? Because we want to remove it. We want to cancel out the one that we made a mistake with, all right, which is the telephone account. We had increased the telephone account by 2,000 Rand incorrectly. So we need to credit it to remove it. Okay, remember, we don't credit bank account when we are doing the correction, because you'd be saying that money is leaving your account again, because we've already credited bank when we made the error and it's on the correct side. We don't deal with the bank again. All we need to do is to debit equipment 2,000 Rand and credit telephone 2,000 Rand. Remember, equipment is an asset and telephone is an expense. Those are two different categories or classes of accounts. I hope that was clear enough. So let's take a look at one more example in dealing with the difference between the commission error and the principal error. Here it is. A purchase of goods on credit from M Zane for 850 Rand had been credited to M Zone. So let's make sense of what's happening here. We purchase goods on credit. Whenever we purchase goods on credit, what do? We debit inventory or goods and credit the particular supplier. In this case, we should have credited M Zane. But what did we do? We credited M Zone. So we credited the wrong supplier. Okay, so the debit is correct. We would have debited the goods or inventory, but the credit would be incorrect. So what error do you think this is? Well, I hope you paused and attempted it on your own here to see whether it's the error of commission or the error of principal. It can only be one of those two errors. Well, M Zane is a supplier, which is a liability, and M Zone is also a supplier, which is also a liability. So if you see two names here, usually you're dealing with the same category, and in this case it is the same category, right? M Zane and M Zone, they're both our suppliers. So the debit is fine, but the credit is incorrect, even though it's the correct amount, but it's the wrong account in a correct category. They're both creditors, meaning they're both under liabilities. So what does that make this? This makes it the error of commission. Why is that? It's because the error is in a correct category, meaning we credited liabilities, because our suppliers whom we buy from on credit are liabilities. So here's what we did. We debited inventory, which is correct, 850 Rand, and instead of crediting M Zane, we credited M Zone for 850 Rand. So we're still within the correct category. We credited our supplier or our liabilities. Now what we need to do is to make a correction. What do? To make a correction, we put the one which we made a mistake on the opposite side. So M zone, we debit it, right, to remove the 850 Rand or to clear out that 850 Rand. And then we credit what we should have credited initially, M zone 850 Rand. Remember inventories, we don't touch it again because we had recorded it in the correct side. So here's how it will look like. M zone debit 850 Rand and M zone credit 850 Rand. I hope that has made sense and you clearly understand the difference between the error of commission and the error of principal. Let's move on to the fourth type of error. Here it is the original entry error or error of original entry. This occurs when a wrong amount is entered to the correct account in the correct side. So the only thing which is wrong here is the amount that you are dealing with. And in this case, the suspense account is not opened. So you can see clearly here the 4 errors we've looked at, we don't open the suspense account. Okay, so you have to pay careful attention to the errors and note which one necessitates the opening of the suspense account. But original entry error is one where the amount is incorrect, but everything else is correct. All right, the correct account is recorded and they are recorded on the correct side. What should have been debited was debited, what should have been credited was credited. And here's an example. A cash purchase of stationery for 430 Rand was recorded in the books as 340 Rand. What do we do in this case? Well, what we notice here is that we bought stationery for 430 Rand on cash. That means we should have debited stationery because stationery is an expense, and credit bank because we bought it on cash. All right, that's what we should have done. And we should have put the amount as 430, but in this case we put the amount as 340, so we made a mistake with that. So here's how we recorded it. Everything is correct but the amount, and you can clearly see here why this error would not be disclosed by the trial balance. By the way, as well as the 3 errors we just mentioned prior, that they would not be disclosed by the trial balance because they're all recorded to their correct sides. Okay, obviously apart from the first one, which we omitted the transaction altogether, that does not affect the balancing of the trial balance. The second one, the commission error, everything was posted correctly. We posted to the correct sides and we posted the correct accounts. Even the principal error, we posted the correct side even though it's to a wrong category. That will not be disclosed by the trial balance because a debited amount is still a debited amount and a credited amount is still a credited amount within those errors. And here with the original entry error, because we are making a mistake with the debit as well as the credit, the trial balance will not pick that up. The trial balance will still balance. As you can see here, we debited stationery 340 and we credited bank 340, even though we should have done so with the correct amount of 430. And that's why the trial balance won't pick it up, because the debit and the credit are still the same amounts. Okay, so this is the error of original entry. What do we need to do? Well, if we undercast or understated the amount that should have been recorded, which we did here, we purchased inventory for 430 and not 340. So we undercasted the amount by 90 Rand. All right, 430 minus 340 is 90 Rand. And by the way, sometimes they may use the word undercast or overcast. All right, so if we undercast, it means that we recorded a lesser amount than we should have. If we overcast, we recorded a higher amount than we should have. But in this case, we recorded a lower amount than we should have. So we need to fix that. We need to record that 90 Rand. What do? You record the exact same entry. You debit stationery and you credit bank. And this time the amount is 90 Rand. So meaning you're increasing the stationery account by 90 Rand. You're also increasing the bank account by 90 Rand. And that will correct the error. Alright. But if you made the mistake by overcasting, then you will have to do the opposite. You'll have to switch the accounts. You would have debited bank and credited stationery to reduce the amount that it was overcast by. But in this case, we're recording everything as there. Debit stationery still and credit bank. And this is how it's going to look. Debit stationery 90 Rand, credit bank 90 Rand. And that is how you fix an error of original entry. And we're going to look at a practical example that you'd see in an exam situation and deal with the correction of errors and the suspense account. Okay, so that's it for the error of original entry. Let's look at the fifth type of error, compensating error. This occurs when two equal and opposite errors make the trial balance remain in balance. All right, what does that mean? It means that two different mistakes have been made. So we made two different mistakes that may not be related, but that means that our trial balance will still balance. Okay, so that means if we've made a mistake of 300 Rand on the credit side, we've made a similar mistake on the debit side as well, a mistake of 300 rand, even though they may not be related at all. What does that mean? That means that the trial balance will still balance even though we may not be aware of this mistake. But here you have to take note. The suspense account is not open in this case because it's not picked up by the trial balance, and you can also correct it without bringing in the suspense account. But you must note that the compensating error may be done deliberately to mask actual errors that would have been committed. If you see that your trial balance is off by 300 rand on the credit side, then you deliberately add 300 rand to one of the accounts on the debit side, which is not a correct thing to do. And that is how, as the saying goes, cooking the books happens, but not always. So let's look at an example of a compensating error. The insurance account was understated by 500 rand. Insurance account is an expense account. We've understated it by 500 rand, meaning our debit in the trial balance would be off by 500 rand. But look at the second part of the sentence. The sales account was undercasted by 500 rand. The sales account is an income account. It goes to the credit side. Okay, so that means that if our debit side of the trial balance is understated by 500 rand, which is the insurance account, and the credit side is also understated by 500 rand, which is the sales account, that means that it will not be disclosed by the trial balance because the error is made on both sides of the account with the same amount. Okay, that's why we put in brackets here, two different mistakes have been made. So in that instance, the trial balance doesn't reveal the error. But how do we fix this error? Well, that's a very simple thing to do. If we've understated it, then we need to put the amount on the correct side. We need to debit insurance by 500 rand and credit sales by 500 rand. That will bring it back to what it should have been. That will fix the error. Okay, and here's how it's going to look. Debit insurance 500 rand and credit sales 500 rand. I hope that was easy enough to notice and you're able to pick it up when you see a compensating error. Okay, so let's look at the sixth one. Here is the complete reversal error. This occurs when the accounts in a transaction are wrongly posted in the opposite sides. And what that means is that what should be a debit is credited and what should be a credit is debited. And in this case, a suspense account is not opened. So for all these errors I've just mentioned, the suspense account is not opened because it does not affect the balancing of the trial balance. Okay, so you won't be able to tell by looking at the trial balance if any of these errors have been made. That is why it won't be picked up by the trial balance and we don't open a suspense account. So the complete reversal error, or the error of complete reversal, means that you have done the opposite of what you should have done with regard to your debit and your credit. So it's very important for you to pay careful attention here and to note how we go about correcting this error, because once you've made an error, you need to first correct the error and also do the correct transaction that you should have done initially. So let's have a look at an example here. A cash purchase of furniture is recorded as, well, before we even look at it, a cash purchase of furniture. If you've purchased furniture for cash, I hope you already know how you would record this transaction. What would you debit and what would you credit? Well, if it was bought on cash, you know that the two accounts there are furniture and bank. So you will debit furniture because furniture is coming in and credit bank because bank is money leaving your account. So if it's recorded as debit to the bank account and credit to the furniture account, then you know it's incorrect already, because by recording it this way, you're saying that money came into your account and furniture left. That means that you basically sold furniture for cash. But here we are told it was a cash purchase of furniture and it's recorded this way. That means they've done the opposite. What should have been a debit is credited and what should have been a credit is debited. So how do we go about correcting this error? Well, this error is called the complete reversal error, or the error of complete reversal. So the first thing that you need to do is to clear out what you have mistakenly done. All right, what I mean by that is that you're now going to debit furniture because you've just removed furniture worth 800 rand from your books. So you need to reinstate it by debiting it, and you need to credit bank because you've said that money came into your bank account, which is not correct. So you need to remove that money from your books by crediting it. So you're just going to do the opposite of what was done incorrectly. Okay, so here's how it will look like. You debit furniture and you credit bank 800 rand. But you have to be careful here because here As you can see the description, reversal of incorrect entry. What we've just done is that we have just corrected the incorrect entry that was initially done. What we have not done yet is to record the entry that we should have recorded initially. Alright, and you can see here, this is what we should have recorded initially. We should have debited furniture 800 Rand and credited bank 800 Rand, but we did the opposite. So the first thing that we do is that we reverse the mistake by debiting furniture and crediting bank. But remember, this is the reversal of incorrect entry. Now we need to do a correct entry. How do we do that? We do the exact same entry. We're going to debit furniture 800 Rand and credit bank 800 Rand. And the description or the narration here is recording of correct entry. I hope it has made sense as to why we are doing two different journal entries. The first one is to reverse the error to make sure that we bring our books to the state it was in before we record the transaction as we should have initially, and then we record the transaction down here. Another way you could have done this, and you may see this in some of the material you look at, and this may be the preferred way of doing it easier and quicker. What you do is that you would record a double amount. Okay, so remember the mistake that we did here is to debit bank of 800 Rand. That means that we overstated our bank account by 800 Rand before even taking into account the transaction. And we also understated our furniture by 800 Rand. So first, we corrected that by doing the first journal entry, and secondly, we did the correct journal entry. So what you can see here is that after we've made that mistake, our bank account needs to reduce by essentially double the amount. As you can see here, we have a credit to bank of 800 Rand, meaning we are reversing the error, and then we record another 800 Rand, meaning to record the transaction we should have initially recorded. I hope it's making sense in your mind. After doing these two journal entries, you notice that your bank account has essentially gone down by 1,600 Rand, which is doubled, right? 800 Rand for correcting the error and another 800 Rand for recording the correct transaction. And the same thing has happened for the furniture account. 800 Rand to reverse the error that was initially made, and another 800 Rand to record the correct transaction. That means our furniture has gone up by 1,600 Rand after we had made the error. And at this point, it means that we have not only reversed the mistake we had done, but we've also recorded the transaction correctly as we should have done. So another way to record this journal entry is just to do one journal entry and to use the amount of 1,600 Rand. And this is how it will look. Debit furniture 1,600 Rand and credit bank 1,600 Rand. And the narration there is reversal of incorrect entry and recording of correct entry. So you could have done it any of the two ways and you would be correct. That is what you do when you have the error of complete reversal. I hope that was clear enough and you have a very good idea of what errors are not disclosed by the trial balance. And these are the errors that we have just looked at. For all these errors, you do not open a suspense account, or you do not make use of a suspense account. When you're doing your journal entries or when you're doing your trial balance, you do not open a suspense account. And that's because the specific errors are not disclosed by the trial balance, meaning that your trial balance will still balance even though you may have any of these errors here. So remember these errors, be able to look at a scenario or a transaction and know what error you're dealing with. Once you know that, then it's easy to know what journal entry you should be doing for which error. Now that we have looked at the errors that are not disclosed by the trial balance, the question is, what errors are disclosed by the trial balance? Well, let's have a look at them. Errors that necessitate a suspense account. That means that we open a suspense account for these specific errors. When the trial balance does not balance, meaning the debit side of the trial balance does not equal the credit side of the trial balance, an error or errors have been made and the suspense account is thus opened. Okay, so these errors here will mean that your trial balance will not balance and you need to open a suspense account, and we'll see how we go about doing that as we do some examples just now. So the first error which necessitates the opening of a suspense account is the part omission error. Okay, so this is where you omitted part of your transaction. This occurs when an entry is made to only one side of the accounts. So you will be given a scenario where you will be told that an entry was only made to one side. Then you know that you have to open a suspense account, because if an entry was made to one side, and by one side we mean either the debit or the credit side, then you know that the other side wasn't recorded, meaning your trial balance will not balance in this case. So let's have a look at an example quickly. The company made a 500 Rand cash purchase of inventory. The only entry made was a credit to the bank account. So the company bought inventory for 500 Rand cash. That means we should have debited inventory and credited bank. But what happened? The only entry which was made was a credit to the bank account. That means we didn't debit the inventory account. So it's a part omission. We omitted one side of the account, either the debit side or the credit side. But in this case, it's the debit side because inventory was not recorded. So what do we do in this case? Remember, we've recorded the credit side correctly, so we're not going to be dealing with bank, but the one that we have not recorded is the one that we have to do a correction on. So the only entry that was done was the bank account. That means the inventory account is what we need to deal with. So we need to record it. So we know that inventory is supposed to be debited, but what are we going to credit? Well, I'm sure you know by now because these are errors that necessitate a suspense account. So we have to credit the suspense account. So you debit inventory 500 Rand and credit suspense account 500 Rand. So that is what we mean when we say that these are errors which mean that you have to use a suspense account or open a suspense account when you're doing your journal entries. So here's how it's going to look. Debit inventory 500 Rand and credit suspense account 500 Rand. You can see we didn't touch bank because bank was recorded and it was recorded correctly. So this is the part omission error or the error of part omission. Let's look at the second error that requires the opening of the suspense account. Here it is, part original entry. Remember we looked at the error of original entry, but this one here is part original entry. When does this occur? Well, it occurs when a correct amount is entered to one side and a wrong amount is entered to the other side of a journal entry, i.e. the debit and credit have different amounts. Now we know that your journal entry needs to balance. Your debit amount must be equal your credit amount. But in this case, when you have part original entry, it means that your debit is not equal your credit. That means what the amount that you put on your debit is not equal to the amount that you put on your credit. Now remember, one amount is correct and the other one would be incorrect. If that's the case, then you have the error of part original entry. Very easy. And here is an example. Inventory sold to Ipile has been correctly recorded in the sales journal as 750 Rand, but had been debited to his account as 570 Rand. Well, if we were to record this transaction correctly, what would we debit and what would we credit? Well, by now, I'm sure it should be easy for you to know your debit and your credit, as I mentioned earlier in the lesson. Our debit would have been debtors control or accounts receivable, whatever term you use, and the name Ipile, or you could just put the name Ipile. That's our debit because that is a receivable, money we ought to receive from someone who sold to on credit. That is why it's an asset. And we credit sales because sales is an income. That is what we should have done. And the amount there was 750 Rand, as we have been told here that it had been correctly recorded in the sales journal as 750 Rand. But it had been debited to his account as 570 Rand. That means that our credit side, which is the sales account, has been recorded correctly, but the debit side, which is the debtors control account or Ipile's account, has been recorded incorrectly. So we need to fix that. Well, the question is, by how much are we incorrect? Well, because we've recorded an amount there, we need to know what that amount is, which is incorrect. That would mean the 750 Rand minus the 570 Rand will tell us how much we understated Ipile's account by. So Ipile's account has been understated by 180 Rand. I hope it's making sense. We took the correct amount that should have been recorded, deduct the amount that you actually recorded, and see what the shortfall is or what you overstated it by. So it could have been an overstatement, but in this case, it's an understatement. So when we recorded it incorrectly, we say that Ipile owed us 570 Rand. But for this transaction, he actually owes us 750 Rand. So we understated his account by 180 Rand. So what do we need to do? We need to record the 180 Rand on the debit side under Ipile's account and credit suspense account. So remember, for all the errors that requires you to open a suspense account, one of the sides will be a suspense account, either the debit or the credit, and you have to know which side that is. So in this case, we're going to debit Ipile's account by 180 Rand. Why? Because we want to increase it because we understated it. If we overstated it, we would have to have credited it, but in this case, we understated it, so we are debiting it to increase the amount he owes us by 180 Rand, and we are going to credit the suspense account as I've just mentioned. So here's how it's going to look like. Debit debtors Ipile 180 rand and credit the suspense account 180 rand. Let's look at the third type of error that requires the suspense account: debiting or crediting twice. This one is easy. This occurs when both sides of the double entry are posted to the same side, and you will be told in the transaction or in the scenario that you have put both to one side. Okay, so let's look at an example here. A payment of 100 rand for rent expense is passed as a debit to the rent expense account and a debit to the bank account. Now we know for every debit there must be a credit, but here the transaction says that we debited both accounts. So one of them must be wrong. And which one is it? Well, that's easy. Rent expense is an expense. We debit our expenses. So what did we do? We debited the rent expense. That means we did it correctly, but we also debited the bank account. Well, if we made a payment of 100 rand for rent expense, that means money is leaving our account. So we should have credited our bank account. So we made a mistake here. Now, in this particular transaction where we made the mistake, we have to do it similarly to what we did in the previous slide, what we've explained, that if you've made an error on the wrong side, firstly, you correct the error and then you record the transaction as you should have done initially. So what are we going to do? Well, we're not going to touch the rent expense account because that was recorded correctly, but we need to deal with the bank account. Since we debited it, we need to credit bank by 100 rand. And what do we debit? Well, if you guessed suspense account, that would be correct. And that's what we need to do here. Debit suspense account 100 rand and credit bank account 100 rand. And the narration there is reversal of incorrect entry. Are we done here? No, we are not. We've just reversed the error. So what do we need to do? We need to record the correct entry that we should have done initially. So what would that be? Well, the exact same entry we've just done here. The only thing that will change is the narration. And here it is: debit suspense account 100 rand, credit bank account 100 rand, and the narration here is recording of correct entry. Again, what is the other way we could have done this? Well, if you paid attention and you understood the one we explained in the previous slide, you would know that we could actually put the amount of 200 rand for both the debit and the credit. That means we debit the suspense account 200 rand and credit the bank account 200 rand. Why? The first 100 rand is to reverse the error and the second one is to record what we should have initially recorded. So that is what we would need to do, and here's how it would have looked: debit suspense account 200 rand, credit bank account 200 rand. And if you had to do a narration, you would have to mention both the reversal of incorrect entry and recording of correct entry. Alright, this one is easier to do. Otherwise, if you're comfortable with doing the two separate journal entries, you can do that. If you're not told what to do in your situation, then you can choose one of the two and you should be marked correctly. Alright, let's look at the fourth type of error that requires the suspense account: overstating or understating accounts. If you have overstated accounts or understated them, then we need to open a suspense account. This occurs when accounts have been overstated. Sometimes they would use the word overcast, or understated, and in that case they would use the word undercast. So let's look at an example. The telephone account is overcast by 240 rand. Very important, by the way, to explain here that this is an error where you have overstated or understated only one account, not your debit and your credit. Remember, if you've overstated both your debit and your credit for the same transaction, that means you don't have to open a suspense account. I hope you remember that from the errors that do not require a suspense account. But in this case, you're given just one account that just either overstated or understated, and you know here that you have to open a suspense account. So overstating or understating accounts, this is for one particular account. Okay, they might give you 5 different accounts, but they're not related in the same transaction. All right, because if I've overstated one transaction where my debit is overstated and my credit is overstated with the exact same amount, that does not affect the balancing of the trial balance. My trial balance will still balance. But here we're talking about the overstatement or understatement of one account. And in this case, as in this example, the telephone account is overcast by 240. That means my telephone account is an expense account. It goes to the debit side. That means if I look at my trial balance, my debit side will be bigger by 240 than my credit side. So this is the one that would require you to open a suspense account. Okay, so if my telephone account is overstated by 240 rand, I need to reduce my telephone account by 240 rand. I know that my telephone account is an expense account, so I need to credit it for me to reduce it by 240 rand. And what do we debit? Obviously, the suspense account. So here's how it's going to look: debit suspense account 240 rand, credit telephone 240 rand. Let's look at the fifth one: totaling error. So this occurs when the total of an account is incorrectly totaled. So you will be told in the scenario that this is what happened. You incorrectly totaled a specific account. So let's look at an example here. The total of the depreciation account is 945 rand, but was mistakenly cast as 1,945 rand. So what have we done to the depreciation account? Well, firstly, we know that the depreciation account is an expense account and our expenses lie on the debit side. And what have we done? Well, instead of putting it as 945 rand, we've put it as 1,945 rand. That means we have overcast the depreciation account, or we have overstated the depreciation account. Be familiar and get used to those terms, because they may use any of those terms. They might say that it was cast as 1,945 rand, as we have done here, or they might say it was overcast by a specific amount, or it was undercast. So just make sure you know what they mean by those terms. Okay, so in this case it was overcast, because instead of 945 rand we have put 1,945 rand, meaning it's 1,000 rand more than it should be. That means if depreciation is an expense on the debit side, we need to credit the amount it was overcast by, which is 1,000 rand. Obviously 1,945 rand minus 945 rand gives us 1,000 rand. So we need to credit depreciation by 1,000 rand and we debit the suspense account. So our depreciation, like I've just mentioned, has been overstated by 1,000 rand. How did we get that? Well, it's the 1,945 rand minus the 945 rand gives us 1,000 rand. So that means we need to reduce our depreciation by 1,000 rand. So we're going to credit depreciation to reduce that expense account and debit our suspense account. And here's how it's going to look. Debit suspense account 1,000 rand. Credit depreciation 1,000 rand. I hope that was easy enough. When you are dealing with overcasting and undercasting, just make sure you know which error you're dealing with, whether you need to open a suspense account or not. Does it affect the totaling of my trial balance or not? That will give you an indication whether you need to open a suspense account or which kind of error it is. And if it's this type of error where an account was incorrectly totaled, then you know it's a totaling error. I need to open my suspense account. You just need to know what the difference is, whether you overcast or undercast. Then you do the entry accordingly. So these are the errors that necessitate a suspense account, meaning you have to open a suspense account. Either the suspense account is going to be a debit or a credit, depending on what the situation is, as you've seen from the examples we've been going through. And you should know which errors do not require you to open a suspense account. I hope this has been clear. We've gone through all the theory in relation to the suspense account and the correction of errors. Now, if you're still awake, you're still up, and you're still learning here, let's take a look at the practical example and try and answer it using the theory we've learned, and also identify what error we may be dealing with here. Here we go. We are given the trial balance, and we are told that the bookkeeper of HKF Limited has prepared the following trial balance. And what you notice in this trial balance is that it doesn't balance. You can see here the total of the credits is not the same as the total of the debits. So we know that something is wrong here. An error has been made. And then here we are given information number 1 to number 6. And we are asked to prepare the relevant journal entries for correction of errors and the general ledger for the suspense account. So we're just quickly going to run through this example. If you don't understand something, you can pause the video and rewind, or go and look at the theory that relates to the particular scenario we'll be dealing with. So here, firstly, we are creating journal entries, very similar to what we've been looking at in the theory, and we have a general ledger that we have to prepare for the suspense account. So if you do not know how to do the general ledger, if you do not know the relationship between the general ledger and the journal entries, I would encourage you to look at the lessons and the links in the description below. They should help you in that regard. But here we're just going to fly through the example because we've gone through the theory. It should be very easy for us to do this. So let's bring up our general ledger for the suspense account. And usually when you're given a scenario like this, a trial balance, and it does not balance, and we're given information, you will usually be asked to do the suspense account general ledger. But sometimes it may just be the journal entries, but you have to know both just to make sure that you've mastered the suspense account. So let's bring up our general ledger account. Here it is. And of course we have the debit and the credit and the name of the account, the suspense account. So whenever you're asked to create the general ledger for the suspense account, you do just that. You name it the suspense account and obviously open the T account. Now let's begin. Remember, we're also doing journal entries. So we're doing journal entries and at the same time we're doing the suspense account. Now, based on the theory we've been going through, when you look at the scenario, you have to ask yourself, which type of error is this? And does it mean I have to open a suspense account, or does it affect the suspense account? For some, it will affect the suspense account, but for some, it will not. So it's up to you to determine which one affects the suspense account. And better yet, if you want great value from this example, to gauge whether you've understood the theory, pause the video here, attempt all the questions, do the journal entries as we've been doing in the theory, and also attempt to do the suspense account. If you looked at the lessons on how to do the general ledger, you should know how to go about this. But if the general ledger is too difficult for you to do with regard to the suspense account, then you can watch the video. But otherwise, for the journal entries, you should be in a position to do it yourself if you've gone through the theory well that we've just looked at. Okay, so let's look at the first example, and I hope you pause the video and you attempted it on your own and gauge whether you understood. But before we do that, here's what you do when you're given the trial balance, which does not balance. We can see here we have the debit 91,714 rand, that's the total, and for the credits 88,881 rand. Now, the first question you ask yourself is, which side is the smaller side? Of course, it's the credit side. Now that we know that the credit side is the smaller side, that is the first thing you're going to do. What is the difference between my debit and my credit? I know the credit side is the smaller side, but what is the difference between the two? That is the first calculation you will do before you even look at the additional information that we are given. Okay, so we're going to take the 91,714 rand minus the 88,881 rand, and it gives us a difference of 2,833 rand. And since we know that the credit side is smaller and it's smaller by 2,833 rand, we are going to put it on the credit side of the suspense account. Okay, so here's how we're going to do it. We put balance and we put 2,833 rand. That's easy marks, all right? So you look at the side which is smaller and you put it at that specific side on the suspense account. If the debit side was the smaller side, then on the suspense account, we would put balance on the debit side and put the amount by which the debit side is smaller. I hope that is clear enough. Very easy to do. That's the first thing you always do when you're dealing with the suspense account. You do the balance and understand that you put it on the side which is smaller. All right, so credit is smaller, we put it on the credit side of the suspense account. All right, that's always going to be the case. Now we can look at our information. We are told here that a mistake had been made when casting the inventory total. The total should have been 8,345 rand. So first question, what type of error is this? Is this an error that will affect our suspense account or not? Well, if it's a totaling error, then we already know that it affects our suspense account if you paid attention to our theory. And let's go back there. You can see here the last error we looked at here. And remember, these are errors that necessitate a suspense account, meaning it affects the suspense account. It says here totaling error. This occurs when the total of an account is incorrectly totaled. Okay, and that's exactly what we are told. A mistake had been made when casting the inventory total. The total should have been 8,345 rand. So what did we put it as? Well, if you look at our trial balance, the inventory amount that we put was 9,534 rand. So we made a mistake. We put a bigger amount than it should have been. It should have been 8,345 rand. So the mistake that we made there, or the actual amount we put incorrectly, was 1,189 rand. That is the 9,534 rand that we had put in our trial balance minus what we should have put, 8,345 rand, meaning we overstated our inventory account by 1,189 rand. Okay, so we overstated our inventory account. That means the debit side is bigger by 1,189 rand, because inventory is an asset, it goes to the debit side. So what do we need to do? We need to reduce our inventory account. How do we do that? We put it on the credit side to reduce it. I hope that has made sense. So we're going to credit inventory 1,189 rand, and since we know that this is a totaling error, it affects our suspense account, we're debiting the suspense account. And here's how it's going to look. Debit suspense account 1,189 rand and credit inventory 1,189 rand. If you attempted it, I hope you got that correctly. Now that we know that our suspense account is sitting on the debit side, we looked at our general ledger example and how it relates to journal entries, then it should be easy for you to do this. We're going to put the debit side inventory and we put the amount there, 1,189 rand, and that's exactly how we do it. Inventory 1,189 rand. Now you make sure you're also correcting your trial balance as you move along, all right? Because part of the question might be you need to prepare a corrected trial balance. So as you address each specific scenario or each specific information that we're given, you are correcting the trial balance. And there you can see we've cancelled the incorrect one and put the correct one, because we just put it in the journal entry as you saw, and we've now put it in the suspense account as inventory 1,189 rand. Let's move on to the second one. A credit sale made to A Barnabas for 250 Rand had been debited to A Barnabas. So we're assuming both of them are our debtors because we sell to them on credit. We made a credit sale to A Barnabas for 250 Rand, but we debited it to the wrong debtor, A Barnabas. Now, does this affect our suspense account? Well, if you looked at our theory, if you remember correctly, it doesn't affect our suspense account. But what type of error is this? You can see here, is this error of principal or error of commission? Well, this is error of commission. Why is that? Because it's to a correct category. Remember, A Barnabas here and A Barnabas are both our debtors, so it's the exact same category, meaning our assets. So it's an error of commission. As you can see here, this occurs when an amount is entered on the correct side of the wrong account, but to a correct category. You must remember this one clearly as we went through it in great detail. And these are errors that do not affect our suspense account. Can you see here, suspense account not opened? So it doesn't affect our suspense account. So what do we need to do here? Well, we need to credit this data here called A Barnabas because we debited it to his account incorrectly. So we need to remove it from his account or reduce his account by this 250 Rand. So we're going to credit A Barnabas and debit A Barnabas, the correct one that we should have debited initially. And this is how it's going to look. Debit A Barnabas, the correct data, and credit A Barnabas, the one we incorrectly allocated to. I'm sure that was clear enough. And remember, these two are our debtors. Okay, so you can see here the debtors amount 4,234, and that's not going to change because both debtors are sitting in this amount anyway. All right, so it's not going to change. We're just switching the two debtors. So usually when you make a mistake with your creditors, allocating it to one creditor instead of the other, or allocating it to one debtor instead of the other, then you know it's an easy one. It doesn't affect your suspense account. You're just going to pass the journal entry, and you know our suspense account is not going to be touched. Right? And that's it for that one. Let's move on to the third one. Equipment bought for 700 Rand was debited to the purchases account. Now, equipment is an asset and purchases is an expense. Those are two different categories. So if the mistake was with the categories, posting it to the wrong category, we have an error of principle here. And let's go back and see. Error of principle here says that this occurs when an entry is posted to the correct side of a wrong category. We posted it to the expense account instead of an asset account. And in this case, the suspense account is also not opened. So don't confuse this again with the error of commission as we had initially mentioned. So what are we going to do here? Well, we're going to debit our equipment account because that is what we should have initially done, but we debited the purchases account. Purchases is an expense account which sits on the debit side, so now we need to reduce our expense account by 700 Rand. So the journal entry we're going to pass here is debit to equipment 700 Rand and credit to purchases 700 Rand. Now we are reducing our purchases by 700 Rand, but we are increasing our equipment by 700 Rand as we should have done initially when we recorded the transaction. Remember, this does not affect our suspense account because it's an error of principle. Now what we need to do is just to correct our purchases account, meaning we're reducing our purchases account by 700 Rand and we are increasing our equipment account by 700 Rand. So let's do that. As you can see there, we've just increased our equipment account by 700 Rand and reduced our purchases account by 700 Rand. We're making progress. That was it for the third one. Let's look at the fourth one. Inventory purchased for 680 Rand from K. Kayla had been correctly recorded in the inventory journal, but had been credited to her account as 80 Rand. So we purchased inventory from K. Kayla. Obviously, K. Kayla is our creditor, someone we purchased from on credit. And we had recorded it correctly in our inventory journal. But when we're crediting her account, we only put it as 80 Rand. All right. So what type of error is this? And does this affect our suspense account? Well, if you guessed yes, that should be correct because this is the part original entry error. Remember when we said the debit amount is different from the credit amount. So this occurs when the correct amount is entered to one side, the wrong amount is entered to the other side of a journal entry, and that is the debit and credit have different amounts. And that's exactly what has happened here. Our inventory journal is recorded correctly, but when we're crediting to our account, we credited it with the wrong amount. So the first question we ask ourselves is, by how much did we understate her account, K. Kayla's account, that is? Well, we understated it by 600 Rand. That is the 680 Rand minus the 80 Rand gives us an amount of 600 Rand. So it was understated by 600 Rand. The only one we need to fix is K. Kayla's account because our inventory journal was recorded correctly. So we don't touch the inventory account. So we need to correct K. Kayla's account by 600 Rand. K. Kayla, we're assuming, is our creditor because we purchased from her on credit. If we purchased it on cash, then we'll be dealing with bank here, but it's on credit here. So we have to correct or increase our creditors account by 600 Rand. So how we're going to record this 600 Rand? Well, we're going to credit KKla 600 Rand because KKla is our creditor and creditors are liabilities. They are recorded on the credit side. And what we debit here? Well, we know it affects our suspense account, so we debit our suspense account. So let's do just that. Debit suspense account 600 Rand, credit KKla 600 Rand. Now we need to obviously correct our trial balance by increasing our creditors account by 600 Rand. But what do we do with regard to our suspense account? Well, we can see our suspense account is debited here. So we're going to put it on the debit side of the suspense account, and the description there is KKla. So let's do just that. KKla 600 Rand on the suspense account. And again, we increase our creditors amount from 5,311 Rand to 5,911 Rand, and that is because we increased it by the 600 Rand that we initially understated it by. I hope that has made sense. Let's look at the fifth one. Salaries and wages of 165 Rand was credited to both the salaries and wages account and to the bank account. Okay, so what happened here? We paid salaries and wages of 165 Rand. Alright, and we're supposed to debit salaries and wages 165 Rand because salaries and wages is our expense, and credit our bank account because our bank account is decreasing. But what did we do here? Well, we credited both the salaries and wages account and the bank account. So the bank account is correct because we're supposed to credit it anyway. But the salaries and wages account is an expense account. We're supposed to debit it. So the mistake is with the salaries and wages account. Now, you must remember what type of error this is. This is an error where we have put both accounts on the same side. And we know that this affects our suspense account. If you go back, you will see debiting or crediting twice. This occurs when both sides of the double entry are posted to the same side. And that's exactly what we've done. We posted both the salaries and wages account and the bank account on the credit side. So obviously only one of them can be correct, which is the bank account, as we've just stated. So what do we need to do? Well, we reduced our salaries account by 165 Rand instead of increasing it. So what do? Firstly, we need to correct that, meaning we debit our salaries and wages account by 165 Rand and then record the correct entry as we should have initially done. Now you must remember this. Now what I will do is just create one account and just take the 165 Rand plus 165 Rand. That will correct the error and also record the corrected amount. Okay, so amount to be corrected and the recording of a correct entry is the 165 Rand, which we're going to debit salaries and wages with. That is for correction of error, and the other 165 Rand is to record it as we should have initially done. Okay, so the first 165 Rand is to reinstate the amount because we decreased our salaries and wages mistakenly by crediting it, and the second one is to record the 165 Rand expense that we incurred, and the total here is 330 Rand. So I'm just going to do one journal entry. Remember, you have an option of doing two journal entries which will look exactly the same. The narration will be different. One is the correction of error, the other one is recording the correct entry, or you can do one journal entry, and here's how it's going to look. Debit salaries and wages 330 Rand, and of course the contra entry there is the suspense account 330 Rand. Remember, this is an error that affects our suspense account, so you have to take note of that. So we're going to credit our suspense account, as you can see here. So we're going to put it on the credit side. We're going to put it as salaries and wages 330 Rand. Now what we need to do is to increase our salaries and wages account in the trial balance over here by 330 Rand. So let's do that. Salaries and wages, we've just increased it by 330 Rand. So we are correcting our trial balance as we go along so that by the time we are done, we know that our trial balance is corrected and it should balance once we are done. Let's look at the last scenario here. A transaction of 1,374 Rand for a cash sale was correctly debited to the bank account, but no credit entry was recorded. So what has happened here? Well, we had a transaction for a cash sale and we only recorded to the bank account, which was correctly done. So if no credit entry was done, that means this is part omission. We only omitted part of the transaction, which means the contra account, because we recorded the bank account correctly. So if it's part omission, we know that it affects our suspense account. Remember, this is not complete omission, this is part omission. All right, and part omission here does affect our suspense account, as we had seen earlier. This occurs when an entry is made to only one side of the account. Okay, so what's the other side that we omitted? Well, if it's a cash sale, we know that we're supposed to debit bank because we received cash, and bank is an asset. And what do we credit? We credit sales. and that is what we should have recorded. But we omitted the credit entry because it was not recorded at all. That means that we need to record the sales account, which was not recorded. We know sales is an income. It goes on the credit side. So we're going to credit sales, 1,374 Rand. But what is our debit? Well, we know it affects our suspense account. We're going to debit suspense account. And that's how it's going to look. Debit suspense account, 1,374 Rand, and credit sales, 1,374 Rand. And since it affects our suspense account, what are we going to do? We're going to debit our suspense account, and the detail there is sales. So we're going to write sales, and we put the amount 1,374 Rand. And what you'll notice is that we just corrected our sales account. There we go, 17,454 Rand. And we got that by taking the 16,080 Rand, which was initially in our trial balance, and adding the 1,374 Rand. And that is it for correcting the error which was made in the 6th transaction. Now what needs to happen is that our suspense account needs to balance, alright? The total of our credit needs to be the same as the total of our debit. So we need to add our debit 1,189 Rand plus 600 Rand plus 1,374 Rand. And that total should be the same as the total of 2,833 Rand plus 330 Rand. So let's see what the total is. You can see our debit is 3,163 Rand and our credit is 3,163 Rand. If they both balance, that means that you are correct and you've done everything correctly. That means your trial balance will also balance at this point. Since you have made all the corrections as we've gone through each transaction, your trial balance should balance. Now, if you add everything correctly with the corrected trial balance, you will note that it balances. And here it is. I've added everything together with the new amounts where we made the corrections. And you can see we have 90,855 Rand for the debit and the credit side. So everything has been done correctly, and that is how you would know. I hope it has made sense. I hope you now know how to do the suspense account and you have everything that you need for you to complete the suspense account and to handle any question with regard to how to do the suspense account. Now, if you'd like more questions on the suspense account or the material we just used in this lesson, well, you can join our membership and get access to all the documents that we've used, additional question papers and examples relating to the suspense account and every other lesson that we have done on YouTube. So if you can click on the join button at the bottom, you would see what we mean. You will get access to all our documents and even some of the lessons that we have for purchase. You will have free access to all of them. We also give priority to our members who ask questions relating to any lesson we have covered on YouTube and they would like clarity. So if you'd like to do that, please do join us. Otherwise, if you've gained value from this lesson, if you've learned something, consider subscribing to our channel, like this video, and share it to those who think it might help. Till next time, cheers.